Our first speaker is the Distinguished Professor of Risk Engineering at NYU. Bloomberg named him as among the 50 most influential people in the world in finance. One of his books was described by the Sunday Times as one of the 12 most influential books since World War II. And the Times described him as, quote, the hottest thinker in the world, unquote. So please help me welcome Nassim Nicholas Taleb.
Usually when you talk about risk, you hope for failure, because it illustrates the point much better than success. So there's a paper co-written with a bunch of people in this room, Joe Norman, Yanir Banyan. We even have a philosopher involved who gave us a metaphor that if you have a blind horse, you want your horse to be slow, okay? And other people. This was put on the web in 2014, and some events, of course, prevented us from publishing it, mainly a smear campaign, okay, by Monsanto. Something like 1,500 letters to NYU and other things. So, but of course, we're going to publish it. I'm not going to talk about genetics. I'm going to talk about past dependence, mostly. So it's what happens when you look at risk dynamically, not statically. And something very trivial that practically every trader knows, but somehow people who don't engage in risk-taking professionally don't know it because they haven't had to face the problem. And also, traders don't write books, so you don't have that problem. So, let me start with a very simple concept and with the following point. If you iron your clothes first, then wash them, do you get a different result from if you first wash and then ironed? You think, okay, so, I have not tested it myself, but you're free. Okay, so now we have a past dependence, sequence of events matters. Hence, any form of analysis needs to be dynamic of the outcome, not static, okay? All right, so now we take another point that's sort of been every single surviving trader or surviving risk-taking person knows is that in order to succeed, you must first survive. It's not like two different additive components, okay? So, simple, but let's see why it has non-trivial mathematical consequences, and it was missed, supposedly, by the decision science literature for the past 300 years, and I was very lucky to be ignorant of the decision science literature, which allowed me to write my first book, Dynamic Hedging, not knowing something. And it was Murray Gell-Mann who discovered a couple of years ago that it was missed by the decision science literature. Let's take the following case. You have a bunch of people who want to go to a casino. Okay, sample n of 100. You send them to a casino with constant betting rules and same allocation for one day. By the end of the day, how do you get the return from a casino? How do you get the alpha of the casino? Assuming your sample is large enough to capture under that gambling policy the casino return. So how do you get? What do? You average, no? So you average the return. So if this fellow here on number 28, we index him number 28, he's ruined. Number 29 doesn't care, no? We'll even laugh at him, okay? So you get the return of the casino via some very simple averaging, and that's what we know is something called the law of large numbers, what happens to the stochastic properties. Now, if you decide instead to go to the casino for 100 days with the total allocation, same total allocation, and engage in gambling policy, okay, if on day number 28 you go tapioca, to use the lingo, what happens to day number 29? There is no day number 29. So you cannot get what we call ensemble probabilities, ensemble averaging, from over time for a single individual. It's non-trivial. Why? Because this average here is computed as an arithmetic average. and this is a multiplicative. And Einstein said the hardest thing to understand is compound interest. Okay, having spent 34 years in finance, I'm old, so 33, all right? So you realize the first thing people don't get is compound interest, okay? So if you have a zero somewhere, okay, it matters, okay? So it tells you the following, something very simple. If you invest in the stock market, under any policy, you will never get the return of the stock market, okay? Not under any policy, except there's only one and only one, is something called the Kelly criterion, dynamically. Because if you have an uncle point, in other words, in 2009, you lower your allocation, something happens to you, you're not going to get the return of the market. So ensemble probabilities are very hard to compare to time probability. So let me continue. Peters and Gelman in 2016 showed something. I showed it in 1997. I called it never cross a river if it's on average 4 feet deep. Okay, and then we formalized it 2018 with a paper called The Mathematical Foundation of the Precautionary Principle, which I summarized very simply, that time averages have different dynamics, and then you're subjected to absorbing barrier. Okay, so you have to worry about tail risk, and why tail risk are a complete different animal from regular variation. What Gelman figured out is something vastly worse, and he called it non-ergodicity. Is the fact that if people have the illusion that over the long run, things average out for you. They will not average out for any single individual. They will average out for a collective. So let's say here you have sample pass. You start you. Over time, your variance of outcomes will increase. You see? It will not decrease, you individually. So in other words, things will never average out for you. So when you take a decision, you've got to make sure you're going to make it to the end. You cannot use. So all these theories of probabilities about, multiple world that you're selecting from sample, all that doesn't work under that, rigid structure where you follow only one sample pass. Okay? And that was what Gelman and Peters and Gelman, actually. It was Peters' idea, and Gelman was the co-author, for the problem. Okay, so now we understand one thing that practically every trader knows. Goldman Sachs have been around, I hate them, but they've been around 149 years. Okay? How did they make it? Because they have a rule. They don't want small tail risk. You know what they want? Zero tail risk. Okay? Zero, not small. And I was a pit trader. You go stand in you destroy your vocal cords. You get a lot of germs. You learn a new language. You know how to trade with hands. You know how to get attention in a pit when there's a crash. So a lot of things. But the first thing you learn is what every single old trader tells you, is the following. Don't worry about losing money. Lose all the money you want. Just worry about being here tomorrow. Surviving is a completely different animal. Okay? And that's basically different dynamics of tail risk. Because very simple. If you have a small probability of ruin under repetition, what will happen to you? Well, you know what happens to you. Things add up. So the problem of not evaluating things dynamically, okay, but if you take the decision science literature, and there is a long literature, we're going to look at it, the literature of quantitative behavioral economics, or all these things. They haven't figured out that your risk should never be evaluated as one-shot experiment. You see, you just got to evaluate as a series, and then therefore things that appear completely irrational, such as paranoid behavior, paranoia, are necessary. They're not even irrational, they're necessary. And let me give you a very simple example. Let's say that why your evaluation needs to be done in a certain way. Smoking, okay? If you do one-shot experiment, smoking, okay, it's irrational to not smoke if you enjoy a cigarette, and the reduction of life expectancy from a cigarette is very small, no? Okay. But why don't we smoke? Because there is a correlation between smoking, not dying after a cigarette and smoking again. Right? So therefore, you got to look at things dynamically. Dynamically is a different thing. If they say, oh, he's paranoid by giving you a payoff structure and looking at your risk aversion and thinking they can measure it, that's what psychologists did. And on top of that, with students, what if you're parked outside? What if you're going through a divorce? What do you have risk? What have children you may have to put through college? All these things infect your decision. I mean, so you cannot isolate decision, any single decision from your lifetime thing. So what we say, evaluate by lifespan, is very simple. Every action you do it is how many times you're going to repeat it over your lifetime, how much it reduces life expectancy. So you cross the street, you reduce your lifespan by 1 in 47,000 years. Not a big deal, all right? Unless you plan to live forever, it's not a big deal, okay? But there are things that reduce life expectancy, particularly if you repeat it. So you take your life expectancy, which effectively is an unknown variable on top of that. So you have to integrate in a different way. So the other problem is, let's talk a little bit scientific consensus. Because people think that you have science, and then on top of that, statisticians deciding on, hey, this is okay statistically, and then on top of that, for risk, you cannot go by consensus. And let's say you have a 0.1 error rate, which effectively, very statistically significant safety of the airplane. How many pilots would still be alive? Okay. Do you realize that the probability of crash, probability of death on a plane is less than 1 in something like 55 million per, so something of that order, something obscenely small, okay? So we're saying that in risk management, different criteria than science. You can't say there's scientifically established that, because you've got to go higher. And in my session tomorrow, we're going to talk about p-values. Anybody who thinks p-value are scientific has a problem. We're going to show the following, that if you have a p-value, the phenomenon has a p-value of 0.12, which is 0.12, 25% of realization of that phenomenon will produce a p-value of less than 0.01. Okay? So often, p-value is not an observable phenomenon. It's a stochastic number that people don't realize, particularly when the researcher does many experiments till you get the p-value below 0.01 or whatever you want. Okay? So p-value, don't tell me it is scientific. Now finally, comes the precautionary principle. We're talking about lifespan, no? Okay. How do you look at it? There's you. You'd like, my lifespan is, I don't know, particularly if you eat yogurt and work out at the gym, stuff like that, your lifespan is what, about 120? Right? People in this room maybe 125, right? So you reduce from that. But there's something bigger than your family, friends, and pets, okay? So your death plus their death adds up. So you have a bigger reduction in life expectancy if you involve more than one person in that group, okay? And then you keep going. Now you scale it up till you hit on something like self-defined extended tribe, okay? However you define it, okay? Like Squid Inc. We have a Squid Inc. Ears on Twitter, for example, group is self and their descendants, all right? So, and then here is humanity. Okay, so if I cross the street, I'm not reducing humanity's lifespan because it's an independent thing. But if all of humanity cross the street at the same time, you may have a problem, okay? And then, of course, the ecosystem. So you realize that the higher you go, the more of a penalty because, very simple, accounting things, you're reducing life expectancy if you're going to do that policy forever. So this is why we got to be very careful. Now, another thing I learned from trading, and something I learned from Warren Buffett, is always say no. Right? You say no. Warren Buffett says no systematically. All right? Or he says very politely, I'll think about it, which means no. All right? Always say no because there's, you don't want returnless risk, okay? Unless you paid a lot for something. So you notice people have survived. They don't take tail risk. And they have their benchmark to invest or do anything is very, very high. It's people who invest other people's money who get in trouble. typically. Now, one small little thing about behavioral finance and behavioral quantitative finance was that theory of nudging is very simple. Let's go back to the casino. I remember my policy in the casino. All right, I go bust. There exists one-on-one policy to not go bust in the casino, and it entails playing with the house money. Okay? In other words, you invest, you start taking more risk as you're making more money. Okay? That's the only one that will allow you to capture what we call the return, the alpha of the casino. Now, it so happens that such a policy is pathologized by Richard Taylor, who just got the Nobel Prize. Pseudo-Nobel Prize in economics. That he says playing with the house money, he calls it, is irrational. Because why? Because it's irrational to treat money, if it comes from the casino or if it's your initial endowment, for him it's the same money. It's not the same money dynamically. Okay? So no wonder why all these nudge people don't understand that there's a lot of things they consider irrational, such as paranoia. I mean, listen, we've survived 350 million years. So it's not for some schmuck with a p-value to come argue with you that is irrational, right? Okay? It's 350 million years, you gotta be doing something right, okay? Whatever, we can decide. 350 million, I don't know, I mean, maybe 5, depends how you define, you have geneticists here who define humans differently, all right? So let's say as mammals or whatever, or as something that's alive for billions of years. Okay, so now, let me ease into something which is my specialty, fat tails. Okay? What I'm saying isn't particularly intelligent, nor particularly new. Okay? It was voiced in 1903 by a fellow, Lundberg, and formalized in 1930 by another fellow, Cramer, who invented insurance mathematics. And he has this theorem, all right? The Cramer, something called the Cramer condition. If you start an insurance company, you collect fees from people, you see, so you have the thing, it's like a bathtub filling up with water. And once in a while you got claims, agree? What happens for you to have a lifespan, okay, it doesn't have a certain bankruptcy, certain what's called gambler's ruin, certain ruin, the distribution of these claims need to fall within a certain class called the outside the sub-exponential class. Okay, sometimes called super exponential class. What does it mean? Let's see what it means. It's catastrophe principle. It means that if you're drawing from distribution that is fat-tailed, forget about it. Forget about it. You cannot insure this unless you have bounded losses, you have a lot of restrictions. Okay, you can, and that's a Cramer. In other words, you get absorbed. Once you lose money beyond a certain your endowment here, boom, you're out, you're froze, you've lost it. Okay, and otherwise you have a certain bankruptcy, regardless of what your return is, which is why cost-benefit analysis don't work under fat tails. Hence, fat tails. So I'm going to explain fat tails in the least technical terms with the following quiz. I have two gentlemen here, and the total height is 4 meters and 20 centimeters. Okay? Randomly selected from the population. What's the most likely allocation? 4 meters and 20 centimeters? No. What's the most likely combination? Sorry? Okay, I pulled, sorry? 4 meters, 2 meters 10, 2 meters 10. It's very, very unlikely to get 2 meters 10, okay? But it's vastly more likely to have, so in other words, let's say the following. What's more likely in the Gaussian? To have 1 6 sigma event or 2 3 sigma events? 2 3 sigma events, you multiply. Okay, no matter how low that's going to be, will still be considerably higher odds than 6 sigma events. Okay, and the more you go into the tail, the more that break down. Distribution that don't have this property are called in a sub-exponential class. So let's continue now with another quiz. You run into two people, randomly selected from population, and it so happened that the total net worth is $36 million. What's the most likely combination? Exactly. So there you go. For a fat tail distribution, if you have, now that's applied to returns. For fat tail distribution, if you have series of returns, okay, and there's a huge loss, odds are it came from one. For a thin tail distribution, odds are it came from a combination of a lot of negative events. Hence, insurance is split. Thanks to Kramer, he said, you split insurance. Regular insurance, like heart attacks, stuff like that, into one block, which is Gaussian, and you move the rest to reinsurance, which is very, very hard, which is fat-tailed. Okay, or is catastrophe principle. So now we know the difference between thin tail, fat tail. It so happened that a lot of random variables are fat tailed. So, and a mistake people tend to commit often, and Yanir here, we had to fight the State Department, and we had to fight all these guys who couldn't get it. When they start using empiricism, say, hey, I'm a psychologist at Chicago or this, and this so irrational, people worry about Ebola, which killed between 0 and 1 person in America, and this that kills 400,000 a year. Say, no, you idiot. Let's think about it. You go to Mars on Elon's thing as a guest, someone, and there's no communication. And then the minute you establish communication with Earth, you hear, well, 180 million people died. Conditional on hearing that, where's it going to come from? Alcohol, diarrhea, obesity, tobacco, or Ebola? It's close to 100% chance that it came from Ebola, you see? So when you look at the tails, it's a complete different story. You got to analyze things from the tail, okay? And you should never, never, ever compare the means of fat tail distribution with thin tail distribution. You cannot compare the means. You should never do that, okay? So this is The Economist, and I have a trick. Anytime you want to read something wrong, in other words, you put a negative sign in front of it for the truth, read The Economist. Because they ridiculed people who worried about Ebola, right? And of course, Ebola, as you can see, is a multiplicative process, okay? Whereas all these other diseases are not as multiplicative, okay? Maybe, but not as fat-tailed. So, and statisticians, unfortunately, so my work now is what we call Fat-Tailed Project, is find estimators that work for fat tails, right? It's a complete different class of things. And it's not changing the color of the dress. Say, hey, we're going to use a Pareto distribution instead of a Gaussian. The whole story changes. So, and so the whole story becomes very, 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 very different. Now, let me finish one thing before I move now to fragility, concept of fragility. That when we compare policies, we have a tendency of saying, okay, for example, there's some person wants to introduce GM rice, right? Modified rice. Why? Because they look at the benefits. That's fine. But the problem is, if you look from the tails, it's just like the story of Ebola, okay? When you look from the tails, all right, sometimes benefits don't change the tail probabilities. The more you go into the tail, the more, when you look at, particularly if you introduce an uncertainty with your policy, slight amount of more uncertainty percolates big time in the tail. So saying, I'm going to improve the system by improving the mean, okay, you're not moving away from the tail. You're actually getting further into the tail. I mean, there are a lot of paradoxes that come from that. And of course, when we talk about probability distribution, the white here, you see the forget about it there? Even within the sub-exponential, there are a lot of different distributions, okay? Now let's go to fragility and convexity. And actually, everything I'm talking about here is available in 2 books that are freely available on the web. One, a collection of papers in the Fat-Tailed Project, the statistical consequences of fat tails, and the second one on fragility, all right? So I wrote the book called The Black Swan, and then you write in equation form, and it's very strange. People understand stuff in equation form. They can't understand in English. It's the complete opposite. So it's rewriting my books in math, okay, with theorems, then they get it. So let me explain how you change in risk class simply from, okay, for example, when someone says, oh, GMOs, we've done it all the time, we do something called breeding, all right? You know, you cross dogs and you get a different dog, no? All right, so it doesn't work that way. It's sort of like saying, oh yeah, you know, going down from the building, 50th floor, whether you jump or you walk down, it's the same risk class. It's not the same risk class. And the idea of convexity is as follows, all right? The problem is that, well, it's very simple. If I jump a meter, actually I get better. You know, it'll wake me up. It's called exercise, jumping from here. But if I jump 10 meters, I die, okay? So people don't realize that the size or the speed makes a huge difference. Like if you hit the wall at 1 mile per hour 100 times, you're not going to get the same damage of once at 100 miles per hour, okay? So the idea that everything that survived has to have that concavity to risk. In other words, everything is dose dependent. So you change risk class simply with the dose. Very simply, okay? That's the idea of antifragile. So why? Because when you're concave, large events hit you a lot more when you're concave to risk. So that's the idea of fragility. So when you speed up any process, okay, you enter a different risk class, okay? Not for now. I'm sure someone may ask questions for... unless you get scared too much to ask questions after what you're gonna see now. Now comes the problem of dimensionality. Okay, there's something well known called the curse of dimensionality for some classes of processes. Okay, curse of dimensionality tells you the following: that when you go from, you remember, the great Stephen Wolfram was here, and he talked about things that are computationally irreducible. So in other words, you don't know what happened at step n plus 1 from n of 1. So from 1, you have to go through all the steps to figure out what happened. Computationally irreducible. So in other words, you can't see. That's because when you go in higher dimensions, all right, the things become computationally really. That's the NP problem that we have discussed, that Yanir, wrote a note about. As you go into higher dimension, you have more and more computational demands that vastly exceed your computational abilities. So we have all these discussions of P versus NP, that's things you can check and stuff. But it's worse statistically, and let me explain why. When we do law of large numbers, what are we doing? All right? The errors wash out because mathematically you're averaging, so you have pluses or minuses and things wash out. You agree? All right. Now, if I have a vector in high dimension and I want to figure out its tail risks, okay, you're not using the theorem of the theorems that we know for convergence for sums. And we're no longer using also something called the central limit, which is also an averaging thing, a summation. What are we using? The maximum domain of attraction theorem, right? And how is it computed? Same thing as with the casino, by multiplication, all right? So errors multiply. And you already have a problem figuring out what you're going to do with the genes, all right? When you have n higher, it's not monogenic, all right? Combination and combination with the environment. So there's a lot of problems already. But the problem is, if you want to track your error, you got a problem. Tracking your error statistically, because if your probabilities have an error, the thing explodes. So as I go in higher and higher dimension, okay, the relative error swells big time. Look, I mean, it speeds up. So you go from 20, n of 20 to n of 21, and trying to figure out the probability, because you got to realize that God didn't give you the probabilities, except maybe some here, but typically you have to discover them yourself. So you have estimation error, and these estimation error tend to blow up when you compound them, okay? Mathematically it's trivial, but it's a big problem. Now finally, you can see the same problem when we talk about fat tails in higher dimension, in terms of dimension reduction of PCA, how for example, you may have a spurious PCA here. Look how big it is compared to spurious PCA in a Gaussian world. Under summation. The point is technical, but I'm trying to redescribe the problem of fat tails in higher dimension, when you have a lot of fat-tailed variables and trying to figure out how they work together. Okay, so your information, the statistical data you may get, typically will be very spurious because of that problem. And that problem is encountered with big data. As you go into higher dimension, you have a very large D and not enough large N. You need a larger and larger N as your D becomes larger. This is one dimension. And then, of course, people tell us, hey, what are you doing writing this paper in outside your domain, which is probability? And we answer that, and something we're discovering more and more in anything that start having a lot of tails becomes a problem for probabilities. Probabilities, not a problem for let me explain. When people say, "Oh, I understand the risk because I'm a biologist," although we have biologists on a paper, people kept attacking us. You guys are not biologists. We kept answering with the idea, yes, if I want to go to the casino and understand the odds of roulette, do I hire, and particularly for tail events, do I hire a carpenter or do I hire a probability person? Okay, that's what we call the carpenter fallacy. And pretty much any scientific problem becomes a probability problem once you go into either higher dimension or to go for large deviations, not the medium. At the center, it is the specialist problem. For the tail, it becomes a probability problem. So with this, I'll stop, and I guess we can take Q&A. I don't know how much more time there is, Chairman.
Yes, so we have about 10 minutes for questions then.
Sorry? 10.
My concern is that the probability or the tail of the distribution will change depending on how individuals make their decisions. And if everyone try to avoid that tail, would the probability change because
No, okay. We have lived historically in a world where almost everybody avoided the fat tail, and those who didn't are no longer with us, all right? And their genes are no longer with us, and because the point of, hey, collectively, what happens? There's something even more interesting. What happens for fat tails is actually easier to analyze, okay, for large deviations. So, like my story of Ebola, you don't need a lot of information to realize that it's not heart attacks that killed 180 million people, but Ebola, if you don't know what the disease is, all right? So this is why it's easier sometimes to answer the tails. There's a couple more points I want to make here about the idea. That in life, in science, you need to get information. In life, what you need to do is survive, okay? First survive, because it's a condition, okay? So you realize sometimes that people have crazy policies to make things more scientific, whereas in real life, you've got to make it simpler, okay? To survive, because fewer side effects. So when I take a problem, like when I took the GMO problems, I quickly said, okay, what's the GMO, what is their aim? Their aim is to produce cheaper food, okay? I said, okay, cheaper food, okay. I checked the price of a tomato. The tomato at Price Club is at 100, say, is $1. 2 cents go to Price Club, Costco. How much money goes to the production? Sorry, very little. Okay, it's a tiny little. Between, say, 5 and 15 cents. All right, and we're talking. So if you want to reduce the cost of a tomato, and as Yanir has observed, it's all a distribution problem. You got to work on what? On a simple distribution problem. Okay, who figured it out? Jeff Bezos. That's his business. His business is to make product, because you focus on the 80 cents, not on 2 cents you may save, and here you may save 40 cents. So we have one order of magnitude easier problem with fewer side effects. So this is how people think in business. Okay, so it's fine. Science needs to study phenomena, but creating policies out of science is highly insufficient. Okay. You know, you got to put it under scrutiny of probabilistic risk management. That's my whole point. That was my point on Black Swan. Nobody got it. Another question? Almost nobody got it. Yes.
So when you talked about the relation to the decision science literature and the path dependence, I was wondering whether you had looked at the sort of stochastic optimal control version of decision-making problems where you can use a barrier function and actually sort of intentionally prioritize not dying.
All right. So stochastic optimal control is a branch that I sort of like worked with because I worked on stochastic processes when I was a trader, when I was, you know, and stochastic optimal control locally makes sense, all right, but you have to put it in a certain framework. The point is, stochastic, it's a branch of mathematics and decision science that doesn't make claims on how the world should be or what probability should be. You get your probability from somewhere, okay? The decision science literature, since Bernoulli, okay, supposedly got the probability from horizontally, from state space, which is a summation, rather than apply these other things. That's the point. And actually, stochastic control is the approach to take if you want to never blow up. And so, and it will give you the Kelly criterion, okay, naturally.
Referring to the point that you just made about like making tomatoes cheaper and so on, the issue with GMOs, I mean, I come from a farming family, right? And I come from a farming family.
Yes.
And the problem that we have is not that we get the fruit cheaper. It's just that one bad year and it sort of wipes out half of your income. So it is intrinsically a fat tail problem. It's just on another side of the distribution.
Okay. The point is that, of course, you're going to reduce risks and stuff like that, but if you don't use the wrong tools of analysis, okay, you're going to get the wrong answer. But of course, you're going to have some problem not solved by GMOs, but they're not looking at problems that are not solved and have never seen a tail risk study from GMOs. All I saw is some yield improvement, which actually is quite shoddy, right? So that was my point. And then also okay, if you have cycles, all right, ironing out the cycle, and actually we wrote we wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that caused an attack by a fellow, and it turned out that Monsanto wrote his paper because it was removed from Forbes. Okay, a guy called, let me name him. Forbes removed them and all his articles. It turned out, sorry? Henry Miller, yes, he attacked us. The point is as follows. The crisis we had with Greenspan was he's trying to eliminate the cycle, okay, which is very nice. Nobody likes a cycle. You want to eliminate the cycle, okay? So what did we get? We get, by eliminating the cycle, we got a bigger collapse that happened right after in 2000, and we're still not out of it. So you got to be very careful when you try to eliminate something, you know, a natural cycle. Maybe we can eliminate it, but just don't take the first order statement without looking at side effect, like Mr. Greenspan did. Okay. There's a fellow with a beard who seems angry, so maybe.
I'll try to start just by speaking up. So one of the challenges I see is that identifying very small, very thin-tailed risks could be a challenge, right? So if you don't produce genetically modified rice, what is the probability that the lack of something is going to cause something that you haven't foreseen?
Okay,
and so when things get
too... Exactly. That's exactly how they say, well, they say, I'm saving you from a bigger problem, all right? That's an argument every charlatan always uses.
But that's not actually my question, I'm sorry, but it's not that we know the other problem that we're saving you from, but it's that we don't, when we get to very rare events, we don't have the capacity to imagine these the paths in a complex system, so we can't then quantify the two sides of the ledger either way.
The way we have answered it is that if you let nature, you follow how nature has been functioning or has functioned for a long time, okay? And then you say that if you're a statistician worthy of his or her salt, then you would say an N of 3 billion is vastly better than N of 500, okay? So therefore you say, okay, if nature has done it, and what is the closest thing we can do to the risk management system of nature? And that's what we addressed in a paper at length, is that exists a naturalistic risk management system, because conditional on being here after all these years means something has worked out, well. So let's not say this is an unknown, and the new. I mean, you may tell me we live in a modern world, we have a change. I doubt that it's so modern. Okay, that things have changed so much in nature. More questions? Yeah.
So, global warming, I think most of us would agree, is an extinction level event. But then you hear the environmentalists going and saying 97 out of 100 scientists agree, and that kind of we should be talking about risk.
That's great. So she's saying global warming. Okay, there's a consensus, and what do you go with it? We use a precautionary principle by saying the following. Okay, if you're agnostic about global warming, say I'm agnostic about global warming. All right, what do you do? Agnostic is actually a theological term fully used here. What do you do? If you receive a package and you're agnostic of whether there's a bomb in it, what do you do? All right, okay. If you get on a plane and you're agnostic whether the plane will crash, what do you do? So this is called an asymmetry, and that's addressed in my fragility thing. It comes from asymmetry. If there's an asymmetry, all right, don't go with the route that has the negative payoff, okay? So my point is, I don't know anything about fossil fuel, okay? But my point is, if there's, and we wrote a paper actually with Joe Norman and Yanir on global warming. They're saying the following: you don't make a decision on global warming based on what we know scientifically, but based on what we don't know. Okay, and I have doubts if I hear, and if there's uncertainty about whether it's fossil fuel, even more. Okay, let's forget about it. Move elsewhere. Okay, they got other things to do. That's what a trader would do. If I don't know whether the investment is going to bankrupt me, well, if I don't know, well, guess what? I'm not going to invest in it. You see? So it's the same mechanism. And the same answer gives you no to GMO and no to fossil fuel. Okay? In the back. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you've thought about fat tails at the positive end as well as at the negative end.
Yes, but okay.
I'm thinking of funding of science.
About what?
Things that are high risk, but very, very high return, like an energy source that would just put fossil fuels out of business, or...
fat tails, okay, the way you got to figure out something very interesting about fat tails is that the right side doesn't offset the left side. Okay, it's sort of like playing Russian roulette and dying, but winning $1 billion, doesn't offset. Okay, so like they're separable. And in classification of fragility, classification how it's fragile and how the fragility works, you say you don't look at the how convex the payoff is, the positive payoff. You got to only look at the negative one. Okay. To determine if it's fragile, okay? So you want bounded risk and then a big payoff. And if you start seeing that, hey, maybe we're not bounded, in other words, we don't have the floor. When I invest in the stock market, if I invest $1,000, that's bounded. But in real life, it's not that clear, okay? So if you see that it's not bounded, that you exercise principle. But the one thing again, the precautionary principle doesn't allow to every single risk. It should apply to risks that flow up on that scale. And we discovered that although everyone is scared of nuclear doesn't fall under precautionary principle. It falls under regular risk management. People take care of it because you cannot blow up the planet with nuclear. You need a lot of nuclear to blow up things, you see? Whereas with Ebola could spread to the whole planet, you see? Of course, to NEXI, except NEXI, of course, because they have protection and stuff. So, but literally the whole planet. So this is how you got to analyze things based on starting with the extreme deviation and flowing back.
Okay, unfortunately, we're out of time. Let's thank our speaker once more.